We're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Markets Live on today, February 17th, a big holiday in the US, President's Day. So,
President's Day.
yeah, I know that this is a special President's Day edition, and obviously we're going to celebrate the contributions of chief executives like Millard Fillmore, Rutherford B. Hayes, and of course, William Henry Harrison. That's what this day is for, is it not, John?
There was a Simpsons about the lesser known presidents, and it was
Yes.
this song that they put together. I'm sure Conan wrote it, and at the end it was William Henry Harrison. I died in 40 days, and
Yeah,
that
yeah,
whenever I hear his name, I
right.
I regret that. That's the lyric that I think of.
You know, it's so good. I have in my life watched The Simpsons all the way through multiple times. The first when I was a kid and it was coming on TV, and that was like I was pretty young. The second I was in college, and it was a great way to kill time in the middle of the night or fall
Right.
asleep. Um, and now I'm actually watching it with my kids. We're on season 4. It's like this great tradition now. Saturday night is Simpsons night. We all watch together, and it is even better as like a parent
Yes.
in your 40s
Oh, that's a
watching
great parenting
this like
advice.
35-year-old, 36-year-old show.
So
I'm
much to
just
unpack.
It's amazing, and I'm loving it, and the kids are loving it too. So
Speaking of
great
presidents, one of
reference.
my favorite episodes is the episode where George Bush Sr. moves in across the street from Homer, and they
Yeah,
get into this feud.
yeah.
And there's this scene where Homer is taking a box of locusts over to release at George Bush's house. And he says to Bart, "It's all in the Bible, son. It's the prankster's Bible." And it's a funny, Homer Simpson thing to say because it's layering it with deep wisdom, with superciliousness and ridiculousness.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
of course, at the end, President Ford moves in, and they get along great.
Yeah, of
Homer, do you like
course.
football?
Right.
Do you like nachos?
So it's a great President's Day introduction. We are now, what, 1 week out from the greatest Super Bowl in history. And I'm sure everyone shares my feelings on that. I have to brag for a second. I was in New Orleans. Um, I had the time of my life on this crazy adventure where I went down myself. Um, got almost the ticket and almost everything sort of fell into my lap, so it wasn't like this crazy thing I had to finance. And it was just like the best experience. And there was nothing like New Orleans, full of Eagles fans, having a great time, and then just absolutely wiping out the other team. When I mentioned this before we started streaming, John explained that he's got some really controversial views on the NFL. So, while we're waiting for people to join the stream, John, do you want to talk about that, or is that really like should that
Oh, Dave, you're going to
stay
get me. You're
offline?
going to make a lot of enemies for me, Dave, with people I'm trying to make friends with. Um, well, I wear a lot of hats in life. One of the hats I wear is as an academic, and one of the things economists don't like is price fixing. And price
Mm-hmm.
fixing introduces all kinds of distortions in markets and incentives. And I honor the NFL because you can meet someone that you've never met in life, and you will instantly have a shared history with that person by
Yeah,
virtue of
that was that was my whole
following the same
trip
team.
down to New Orleans, was just
Yeah,
meeting people left and right and having just so much fun. If you were wearing Eagles gear, you just made friends everywhere you
right.
went there, and it was a great
Exactly.
experience.
On the other hand, as economists like to say, the the salary cap is a price cap that introduces, in my opinion, some distortions. And really, an economist, the problem with the salary cap is that players are not paid their fair value.
Hmm.
And so the whatever that fair value is above what they're being paid accrues to the owners of football. So football owners are all super rich, whereas baseball owners maybe not. They have to, it ends up they have to invest so much in good players that they're not nearly as rich as football owners. And
Hmm.
that's a football is a can be viewed in this dry economic lens as a rent extraction mechanism
Hmm.
from young people in a dangerous sport, prone to injury. They have a short career, And so in that short career, they've got to earn a lifetime's worth of earnings. So, $20 million sounds like a lot, but if you're only working for 3 to 5 years before you get hurt, maybe not so much.
Mm-hmm.
But what if your fair value is $50 million or $60 million? And so I love the idea of football and a uniting national sport, but I don't like the salary cap.
But how interesting, though, that given that, one could probably argue, and I say this as a lover of baseball. Baseball is probably my number one sport. It sort of goes back longer for me. The kids love it. We play it. We watch it. But I would probably argue at this moment in time, the parity of the NFL has led to a better product than the disparities in the
Right.
spending that you find in
Yeah.
baseball.
Yeah, I love that's Moneyball, right? That's the Brad Pitt line. There's good teams, there's poor teams, there's 50 feet
Yeah.
of crap, and then there's us. I don't
And
dispute
here's
that.
my Billy Bean signed
My
baseball that sits
father
right
would
on
love
my
that.
desk.
My father would love that. Good for you, Dave. I think that's absolutely true, and I think football, the concept of parity, that everybody's at the same level, is fair. But there's another word for that: communism. And so, yes, just
Well,
be aware
football
that
is
yes, everybody's
communist right
at the
now.
same level.
The
But
Eagles are the commissars.
you're right, right.
We are the Politburo.
Of course, there's the whole separate debate about whether it's scripted, but I won't get into that.
I just got to say that Eagles defensive line has an opinion on that. All right, so let's get into it. We're here to talk Reg SHO. That's our favorite topic with one of our favorite guests, John Welborn, senior lecturer at Dartmouth University. And John just has completed work on a comprehensive overview of Reg SHO to mark the policy's platinum anniversary. And I think you called it the first comprehensive analysis of the impact and efficacy of Reg SHO at reducing naked short selling and failures to deliver over its 20-year history. And of course, you sent it to me with just a couple hours to go, so I have not read the whole thing. It's 74 pages. I assume a lot of that is charts.
Most of that's charts and graphs. Yeah.
Most of that. Okay, so then I've probably made it, a good amount of the way through, but I think this is a topic that our audience is really interested in and focused on. And so I'm really happy to have you come on and talk about this draft paper. So why don't we just sort of take a step back? We've spent time before talking about the history of Reg SHO, the loopholes in Reg SHO. You decided to write. How long have you been working on this paper, and where did the sort of initial sort of impetus for it come from?
Well, first of all, Dave, thanks for having me on. I love being on your show, and I love what you guys do to educate retail investors.
Thank you.
There isn't enough of this. There's so much disinformation and misinformation for retail investors, and I think it's very important what you guys do at Urban Finance. So thank you for having me and giving me this chance to talk about, dry academic stuff, but try to present it for an audience that hopefully finds it useful. I've really been doing this for 20 years. Honestly, I started working on this topic 20 years ago when I was in graduate school. By chance, I became involved in some litigation involving naked short selling and securities lending. And that led to this 10-year massive lawsuit that was a state case. It went all the way to the State Court of Appeals, millions of pages of discovery, dozens of experts. And I ended up writing my dissertation on that topic at a time when nobody knew what it was, and largely because there wasn't any data. I did my dissertation in 2013. At the time, we had some data. The SEC had finally agreed to publish some data. But the reason I started writing this paper is it is 20 years on, and what's weird is the data is prevalent but poor quality. And nobody pauses to think about, what does it mean to be on the SHO threshold list? What do fails mean? We know about them. We talk about them. There's kind of a cone of silence around the issue in Washington. And occasionally you'll have a big retail event where a lot of people will get involved and they'll write letters to Congress people. But those letters are largely dismissed by the SEC and others, and nothing seems to happen. So I wrote this paper because I want something to happen. I'm an academic. I try to be objective. I try to be analytical and not get involved. But on this topic, I think it's important that we recognize that the rules have to be changed. And this is a moment, the Greeks talk about two types of time. There's chronos and there's kairos. And chronos is chronological time, and kairos is the time when things happen. It's opportune. And I feel like we're in a moment of kairos right now when things can happen. And so I wrote this paper for regulators, for people in Washington, because I want them to think about what can we do now. There's a new administration, there's new blood in the mix. Let's see, first of all, let's establish what did happen in the last 20 years, and let's use that to inform where we go next.
Okay, so I mean, I feel like that's a good place to start. And we've done sort of the history of Reg SHO on here before, and that being said, we often have new people tuning in. So do you mind just giving us a quick overview of 20 years of history?
Right.
But I think especially now that you've revisited it for your paper, it's fine to let's revisit that and let's start there and establish the foundation that we're working from.
Sure. Actually, truthfully, this goes back 50 years to the Securities Act amendments of 1975, which was a really huge deal. The SEC recognized that there was this problem of paperwork where people would trade securities and they had physical shares, paper shares, that led to something called the back office crisis. And people were moving trolleys full of paper back and forth across the street every Wednesday. The markets would shut down. So they came up with this idea of something called the Central Certificate Service, where they just basically held all the shares in a vault, and then there was a ledger that tracked ownership. That was called immobilization. And then there was another layer of things called immaterialization, where basically the ownership in the ledger was separated from a physical share. We can talk about that later on. Let's flash forward to the 90s. In the 90s, prime brokerage was invented. It didn't exist before. With the rise of hedge funds, the rise of options trading, people were starting to engage in lots of short selling. And short selling is a trade where you borrow securities and you sell them, hoping to buy them back later at a lower price. It's the inverse of long buying. And short sellers are essentially betting that a stock price will go down. The difficulty with short selling is, of course, the step where you borrow the securities from somebody and sell them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a normal situation, it wouldn't matter because you'd find a guy, Tony or Vinny, and say, hey, I'd like to borrow your securities. They'd probably ask for collateral from you, like the cash from the sale, before they sell them. And that wouldn't be a problem because they understand that you're taking a risk, it's their securities, and it's clear the chain of ownership. The problem comes with the fact that we live in a world that is highly dematerialized, where
Mm-hmm.
claims of ownership are separated from the securities themselves, actually by several layers of intermediation, frankly, when you get into how CD and Co and DTC work.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of this short selling happens without the knowledge of the people who actually own the securities. And this really became an issue during the dot-com boom and bust. There's just, the only person I know of to look at the data on fails to deliver, which we'll talk about in a moment, before unsettled trades, before Reg SHO, was a lady named Leslie Bonai. I don't know where Professor Bonai is now. I used to know her. She wrote this the SEC gave her rare access to fails data from the Enron era. And she wrote an excellent paper, which I'm happy to post on Twitter. But it was obvious that there was no mechanism to prevent unlimited selling because the people who owned stock didn't know that it had been lent or sold short. So there was they just had no way to know what was happening, so they couldn't stop it. So in addition to that, the exchanges themselves had different rules. The NASDAQ had one set of rules and the NYSE had another set of rules about what were the requirements before you initiated a short sale. Did you actually have to borrow the securities? Or could you merely have located the securities or made an affirmative determination that they were available to borrow? Because in those days, there was a lot of daylight between the time a trade is executed and the time a trade settles. So Reg SHO, the comment period began in 2003. It was approved in 2004 and it went live January 3, 2005. And Reg SHO is short for short sales. The purpose of Reg SHO was to bring clarity and definition to what short selling is, what is lawful short selling, and in addition to that, what do we do if there are so-called fails to deliver? That is, trades that fail to settle because people have sold securities that they didn't own and were not able to obtain prior to trade settlement, which in those days was 5 days after execution date. And so the SEC in the beginning, the only data point we had was something called the Regulation Show threshold list. And in those days, there were 5 listing exchanges. There are lots of different market centers and SROs, but there are only a handful of exchanges where securities actually list. So you can trade in one place, but you can list in a much smaller universe. Mm-hmm. In those days, it was the NASDAQ, the NYSE, the American Stock Exchange, the Chicago Stock Exchange, and I believe the Philadelphia Stock Exchange. There's been a lot of consolidation in the last 20 years, so that's all changed. So every day, starting in January of 2005, companies could see this list of stocks that had lots of fails to deliver. That's lots of unsettled trades. And they were surprised. What does this mean? Why are we on this list?
Yeah.
And thus began the odyssey of Reg SHO to where we are today.
Okay, so we've talked before about the shortcomings of Reg SHO. And I think actually in your paper you get into your policy recommendations, at least the first 2, mandatory penalties for failing to deliver, and the universal pre-borrow requirement, and I guess the third one even, elimination of all market-making exceptions. These are in fact the 3 loopholes, or 3 of the loopholes we've discussed in the past as well. And in your paper, right as you're talking about not just the fact that these are good recommendations, but the fact that there was quite a bit of support for these recommendations. It's not like these are like, inspired solutions to problems no one could have thought of in the beginning. Like, these are all things that were part of the initial debate on Reg SHO, right, and for which there was a large amount of support in the comment file for.
Yeah.
And yet, the final form of Reg SHO did not include any of this. So let's get honest here. Is to what extent, and maybe you don't know exactly, but from my perspective, I see the influence of Bernie Madoff here really significantly, and that Bernie Madoff was someone at the time who had a lot of influence in the securities industry. It was not yet known the scale of his fraud. He was running a market maker, as well as his quote unquote hedge fund. And even the market making exception to Reg SHO is often referred to as the Madoff exemption. Right. So how much of a role did he play here, and how much do you think that his fraud and what he was perpetrating was sort of behind some of what the final form of this rule took?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So first of all, one of the, it's easy to criticize the SEC, but one of the things I do like about how the SEC works is they are very transparent, at least on following the administrative. We have this great thing called the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires the process by which rules get made. Mm-hmm. And the SEC website is a very effective website now. It wasn't always, at making public all of this history, and they still have it. So you can go to the SEC, you can look up proposed rules and go back to 2003, and you can read all the comment letters, including the comment letter by Bernie Madoff and his brother. And the SEC also has a fantastic, they received so many comments on Reg SHO. So many people were invested in this because people had lost a lot of money in the WorldComs and the Enrons and the aftermath. It was a smoldering crater. And retail investors, people are animated now about GameStop and Robinhood and other things. 20 years ago, it was Enron and WorldCom and others. People were animated, but there was even less data then. So there's a great SEC summary of all the different comments that they received. So the SEC did what a logical thing was do. They proposed 3 things. And let me get to the market making exception third, because I kind of want to finish it. But first, they said, okay, well, why don't we require pre-borrowing before you sell short? Which for any normal person, that's not a shocking thing. is to like that. No human being would design a system that didn't do that, that didn't require that.
Yeah.
You'd have to have several layers of distance from the normal person thinking to think that's a silly thing to do.
Right.
But the objection from the major securities firms was uniform and certain. If you do this, it will kill liquidity. Anything that is done to hurt liquidity makes you a bad person. There's only one bugaboo in securities regulation, and that is liquidity. Everything must be worshipped at the altar of liquidity. And so the notion of a pre-borrow requirement for short sales was pretty quickly defeated. That was the first thing to go in the final version of Reg SHO, unfortunately. And we can talk later about the Emergency Order 2008 and the irony of that process. I hope
Fascinating results from that. Yeah.
The next thing is fails. Why not impose a penalty, a price? A penalty is simply a price, assigning a price for doing something wrong. Why not just assign a price to this thing that is improper at the very least? And the pushback on that was fascinating as well. The securities firms said, no, you can't charge us for fails because we have difficulty allocating them among our customers. It's too hard for us to know which of our customers have failed because of all the layers of pre-netting and things that we do internally before the trades go off to be executed at NSCC and CNS. And that was their argument against penalties, was it was unfair. It was punitive against the securities firm for clients' bad behavior. Well, of course, we know that that's a very silly argument. And we know it's silly because if you look at the Treasury market, and Suzanne Trimbath has written about this extensively, if you look at the Treasury market, the first thing they did when fails to deliver became a problem in the U.S. Treasury securities market is they imposed penalties. And it wasn't a top-down solution. The industry working group themselves said this is what we should do to fix the problem. It's the only rational thing to fix the problem. Right. And I think that the penalty issue is worth pausing upon because we can sit here and debate all the market structure issues in the world of minutiae, but at the end of the day, the most obvious and the simplest and the fairest solution to an issue of large fails to deliver is to simply fine the firms in whose CNS accounts the fails occur. That's the easiest thing to do. Put a price on it, and the rest will sort itself out.
And that's what Europe ended up doing with their settlement discipline regime, right?
Absolutely. Yep. And the Treasury market still does it. Now, that doesn't mean that fails don't happen. The Treasury market still has a fails problem, but at least you've assigned a price to this bad behavior, and at least it puts the burden upon the failer of fixing the problem. And then finally, in terms of market making exception, the Madoff letter that he and his brother submitted is very long. It is worth reading. They really go into detail about why they use all the buzzwords that economists love: price discovery, liquidity, market efficiency. They go into all these explanations for why those engaged in the process of making markets require special consideration from regulators. And it's a brilliant essay for framing how what it was giving regulators. It's the kind of document that you couldn't oppose if you're in the business of making rules, because it was so well argued. And that, I think you're absolutely right, Dave, that mindset is now endemic to how the SEC thinks. You see this with, the Securities Industry Association, now SIFMA. That's all the talking points that they use when rules come up for negotiation. So anyway, those are the three things that I argue that we could be easy fixes to Reg SHO, and it's a real shame that we haven't moved in that direction yet.
Okay, so let's talk about what happened in 2008, because this seems like it was the perfect sort of real-world natural experiment to quickly change the rules and see what the effects were. You want to talk about what the SEC had to do in 2008 and why and what the effects were?
Right. So we all know the 2008 financial crisis. The thing that is, I think, important to remember is it wasn't a shock when it happened. There had been it was a slow motion train wreck where you could see that something was going to happen far in advance, but you couldn't stop it. There were securities firms suspending trading in collateralized debt instruments as early as 2007. So things were happening, but it came to a head in June of 2008. So a little over 3 years after Reg SHO starts being active. Now, keep in mind, from the period from 05 to 08, people like me and clients that I'd worked for and issuers and retail investors had been screaming about naked short selling and fails to deliver for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
They'd been laughed at, they'd been ignored, they had been told they're conspiracy theorists. Meanwhile, hundreds and hundreds of stocks are on the threshold list every day. And remember, the threshold list doesn't just reflect high fails, it reflects persistent fails.
Right.
So you have to have high fails for 5 days or more to go on the list. So the threshold list is like as I said before, it's a list of liquor stores being robbed.
Yeah.
It's like nobody's stopping liquor stores being robbed, just a list of liquor stores being robbed.
Right.
So, and I had several meetings at the SEC. I had several very high level meetings with staff of the OEA, the Office of Economic Analysis, with trading and markets. And at all of these meetings, you would hear the same talking points. Oh, those are corner cases, and we don't regulate for the corner cases. Naked short selling doesn't matter because if markets are efficient, then prices don't care about day-to-day trading volumes. And all this is a day-to-day trading volume. All these silly arguments that frankly don't hold water. Nevertheless, it was the ultimate gaslighting. It was the ultimate gaslighting experience. And, people talk about gaslighting now. We really lived it in 05 and 08 because to just see hundreds of companies on the threshold list and regulators and financial journalists going out of their way to call you a conspiracy theorist was so maddening. It was just enraging. And it took a lot of personal control to learn how the world works, where people just lie to you and say, oh, what you're saying doesn't exist or it isn't a problem.
Yeah.
Then in 08, all of a sudden, regulators were so concerned about volatility in markets and price movements related to this coming financial crisis, these defaults on these debt obligations of these banks, that overnight the SEC under Chris Cox said, you know what, we're going to ban naked short selling, and we're going to do exactly what you wanted us to do all those years. We're going to require a pre-bar.
Yeah.
Now, you might say, oh, they did it for all stocks. No, they did it. And here's the funny part. They did it for 17
banks,
securities.
Right? Yeah.
Not just the banks, the primary dealers, which are the banks that are authorized to trade in Treasury securities.
Yeah.
So we're going to give you exactly what you want, but we're going to do it in the securities of the companies that have arguably been facilitating all the naked short selling and fails to deliver all these years. These are the ones clearing the trade.
Right?
Unreal. And then plus Fannie and Freddie with the 2 to 19. But so, I mean, I remember looking at a friend of mine saying, what timeline are we on? What's happening here? This is exactly what we wanted, but they're giving it to this small group of people who are the only ones capable of having. These are the firms that have accounts with the DTCC where the fails are documented. So why are they getting the special protection?
Right. And I mean, obviously this is a question of political power, regulatory capture, right? All of these things. But regardless, so let's forget about that for a second. They did this, and then what you say in your paper is that when they studied the results of requiring this pre-borrow, they found there was large and statistically significant decreases in short selling volume. They found dramatic but temporary increases in lending rates, and then large significant decreases in failures to deliver, little change in short interest, and then it doesn't look like there were really any market quality changes, which really feels key here, right? Because if we're here worshiping at the altar of liquidity, and you absolutely have to have these exemptions in order to provide liquidity, why wasn't there a change in liquidity by implementing the pre-borrow requirement.
Absolutely right. And furthermore, I want to point something out from this is the SEC's own Office of Economic Analysis writing this paper. This isn't me. This isn't somebody in their pajamas, right? This is the OEA, right?
Okay.
And they're writing this thing. So fails go down. Now there's a distinction between short sale volume and short interest. Short sale volume is like the flow. Short interest is the stock. What they're simply documenting is that intraday, all the slop that happens because of a fuzzy short sale rule regime and settlement system, that goes away. But there's no change in the economically meaningful act of short selling. Those that wanted to be short could be short, as reflected by no change in the short interest, the stock. I should, in the later draft, I should make clear why this is important. But it's just simply that churn, that flow that is reduced, the information empty trading that occurs all day long because of sloppy rules. And furthermore, no reduction in market quality. No significant change in the bid-ask spread or market depth. That's all liquidity people. If you read a finance paper, that's all they care about is what happened to the bid-ask spread. Well, there was no change in the bid-ask spread. Spreads largely for these firms. So it was a completely successful experiment, and there's no reason why we can't have that today. Moreover, a lot of the pushback on pre-borrow might have been technological limitations. That's not the case now. We have all kinds of technology that exists ready to go that can be overnight that can implement any of this. It just requires political will to require it.
I found this your final paragraph before your conclusion was really I don't know, awful and not surprising, but you make the point that the largest Reg SHO fines and most noteworthy SEC enforcement actions have involved market makers and industry professionals who were among the most vocal proponents of the market making exceptions to locate and close out provisions. That includes the Madoffs, Aaronstein, but also UBS, Goldman, Morgan Stanley, and Citigroup.
Absolutely.
And so it was the crooks writing the rules, which is always the accusation, especially in securities regulation. And today we're stuck 20 years later with these same rules and getting the same recycled, tired arguments from the so-called market makers as to why we can't switch to a more rational regime. So, do you hope? I mean, I'm sure you must hope that this paper will at least start to put to rest the common refrains that we hear from them about the need for these types of exemptions in order to facilitate liquidity and trading, and the fact that these exemptions have serious costs to markets.
That's absolutely my hope, and I'm glad you highlighted that paragraph because your viewers may not know, but the Aaronstein case was the first major case. It's 2007 about abusing market making privileges for Reg SHO. It was a huge fine. Scott and his brother Brian together, I think, were fined $8 million, and they were barred from the securities industry for life. It was a major case, and that's the scheme that they were involved in. They were options market makers. They were effectively colluding, allegedly colluding with banks who would buy securities from them that were hard to borrow, which they would then use as a source of locate for their clients, hedge fund clients. And so it's just so funny that you go back and read Reg SHO. Here's this guy, this market maker, arguing we need this exception, and 2 years later, he's one of the first people that they sanctioned for gross abuse. The abuse was so gross, the fails were so huge, they couldn't ignore it. And to FINRA's credit, this case began at FINRA with Cam Funkhauser. The SEC was later referred to the SEC, but it began at FINRA with Cam Funkhauser. He's the one who made them aware of what was going on. So it took one man. King Leonidas of Sparta sent one man, Cam Funkhauser. Wherever you are, Cam, good for you. He brought the Aaronstein case, which got the ball rolling. There's just no justification for any of this. By the way, I think there's I would point out to your viewers something that I think it's worth noting. It's easy to view Wall Street as monolithic, and that they all have the same interest, but that is not necessarily the case, particularly when it comes to hedge funds versus their prime brokers, right? They do not, they sometimes have very adverse interests. And I have found that it's easy to blame hedge funds, and sometimes they merit blame for naked short selling, but the people who execute and clear naked short sales are executing brokers and clearing brokers, and they're the ones who carry the fails on their books, and they're the ones who wrote these rules. And so I think there's an opportunity as well, speaking of Kairos, to have a coalition of those interested in cleaning up the system between retail investors and professional buy-side investors. And I say that a lot, and I say that again here because think about it this way: hedge funds, they don't want to get ripped off by their prime broker by overpaying to borrow. And that's what ends up happening is their prime broker charges them a retail rate, but doesn't bother borrowing from a custodian on the wholesale side in what should be here. So really what's happening is the naked short selling scheme, yes, it rips off retail. It also rips off a whole class of professional buy-side investors who are overcharged for borrowing hard to borrow securities in these situations.
And let's talk about there's a lot. I mean, we have a lot to talk about. I want to talk about though the ETFs, and I want to talk about it from that perspective, what you just talked about. So when I look at these crazy levels of fails on ETFs and persistent fails, and these ETFs being on the threshold list for hundreds of days at a time, and consistently being on that threshold list, don't you think the ETF issuer has a reason to be very upset about this? And is it? I'm curious because in my mind, and I understand sort of the creation, redemption, and market making side of ETFs. That's where I worked for quite a bit of time. But when it comes to sort of the plumbing and settlement of those, and then the way that issuers make money off of them, I'm less well versed on that. But to me, when I see something like XRT on the threshold list, essentially in perpetuity, do those failures mean that there are retail investors out there holding shares of XRT, thinking they have shares of this ETF, but they don't, because there's been a failure to receive persistently? And does that mean they're not even paying the fees that should be accruing to that ETF issuer?
Right. So first of all, I'm glad you brought up ETFs. We need to talk about ETFs. What's that movie we need to talk about, Kevin? We need to talk about ETFs. First of all, what's so funny about the Reg SHO threshold data is many of the SEC made a mistake. Maybe it was intentional, maybe not. But the threshold list data do not contain CUSIPs. You have a symbol and you have a name, and that's it. One of the reasons this paper took me so long is working with, I have a research assistant, Jackson, who is a genius, and Jackson and I have spent months scrubbing these data, trying to code the securities on the threshold list. And now the FTD data are better. They have CUSIPs in there, but you still have lots and lots of corporate actions, things that are missing. We use various academic databases to try to essentially reconstitute a full history of what's happened here, because it's not as simple as taking this list of symbols and putting it in. Symbols get recycled, they get rejected, they get canceled, they get changed. Same with CUSIPs. So there's a lot of work that goes in. Nevertheless, at the end of all that process, what we found is after 2008, I think of Ross Perot and the giant sucking sound. All of the fails, many of the fails, shifted from common stocks into ETFs. It was very sudden. So the options market maker exception gets eliminated. The grandfather clause is gone in 07. Rule 204T is proposed. This is a rule. This is part 204 of Reg SHO, which really said, listen, we didn't mean it when we talked about closeout requirements before. Maybe you didn't understand we were serious. Now we're really serious. These are closeout requirements. Maybe you thought that we weren't serious before. Now we're really serious.
We're super serial guys.
We're super serious now. We're super serial now. So whatever the case is, there's this giant sucking sound into ETFs. And for the period from, say, 2009 to 2019, ETFs are really 75% of all fails and of all securities on threshold lists. They're a huge quantity. Now that after 2019, it's gone back to being more or less 45 common stocks ETFs plus some slop in there for ADRs and warrants and things. But
okay. And now
really
that's
from
interesting
09,
because if you look at the charts that you have in there, for example, the daily total FTD in dollar terms,
yes.
it's not like you're seeing a trend of it going down or anything. It stays almost
Yep.
consistent from
It's a slow
beginning, from
average
2009.
3
Yeah,
billion a
go ahead.
day average. It doesn't change. It doesn't matter where you
Yeah,
go 15 years ago, yesterday, it's averaging 3 billion a day in fails. It's very consistent.
yeah. But you're saying
So
the makeup of those fails
it's the
has actually
composition that's
shifted.
changing, and
Composition.
that's what's so interesting about doing this in this party is the composition is changing. And so what is the role of these ETFs? XRT is the mystery. XRT should be the number one thing that regulators are investigating right now. What is
Yeah,
going on with XRT? It's been on the Reg SHO list for 1,691 days total,
yeah.
the longest of any security by far. The next longest common stock was Overstock.com. That wasn't even on for 1,000 days. So XRT being on for 1,600, it's almost 1,700 days, it merits attention. At the very end of the paper, I use some data that I have, which are somewhat proprietary on securities lending and short interest from FIS. XRT regularly has more than 100% on loan, and it often has as high as 200 or 300% has been lent and relent and borrowed.
Most people, any rational person who would have heard what you just said would have been like, "What? Like, how is this even mechanically possible?" And I
How is
know
it mechanically
you've
possible?
answered this in the past, and you've said the answer is always rehypothecation. It's turtles all the way down, right? It's rehypothecation all the way down, and yes, okay, so there's an answer and a term for it, and it's still mind blowing that this
It's still
even can happen.
it is, rehypothecation occurs. It is nevertheless rehypothecation absent informed, I would call it, I love this phrase, informed consent. Like beneficial owners don't give informed consent to have all their shares lent infinity number of times.
Right.
And with XRT, what's going on there is far beyond rehypothecation. First of all, the fact that it's on the threshold list shows you that it's not just a simple matter of honest chain lending from party to party, right?
Right.
The fact
Right.
that there are fails on the threshold list forever means something else is going on. There's naked short selling happening. I have long suspected, and you and I have talked about this, that what's happening here is ETFs are being used as a source of borrow. There's somehow, by naked short selling the ETF, you are engaging in some kind of a basket swap that allows clients to get synthetic short on the other side of the trade somehow. The mechanics of that are a mystery to a lot of people. Somebody knows for sure,
For sure.
but no one's written about it in the academic literature. The SEC has studied it. I know they have an investigation into it, or at least they did have an investigation into it. As far as I know, that investigation has not concluded or revealed anything of substance, and the matter continues today. So whatever the answer to this ETF problem is, it's still prevalent to this day. And XRT is the number one, but not the only one. If you go to my list, if I bring it up here of the top stocks, first of all, XRT is the longest. If you look at the next 10 longest, they're all ETFs as well. You have, and many of them are leveraged. Some of them are commodity ETFs, gold, energy, like treasury bond ETFs, rates ETFs, things like that. So many of those that have been the longest are these leverage ETFs. So it could be that there's some sort of weird thing happening with the leverage ETFs that creates incentive to naked short sell them and not deliver for long periods of time. I don't know. This is the start of a conversation. We need help with this, figure what's going on. What I found most interesting
in this
about
chart, is that right? That XRT, this says the max loan was 699%.
Absolutely. There were
So
a couple of
seven
days,
times.
7 times Lent. 7 times Lent. And it was by far the most. So if I, those data, it's hard because the only data set that you can use is something called CompuStat. CompuStat tracks daily changes in shares outstanding. ETF shares outstanding change on a daily basis because there's a continuous creation and redemption mechanism. Other academic databases that people use track shares outstanding on a quarterly basis. Like everybody uses CRISP in academia, the Center for Research and Securities Prices. CRISP only tracks quarterly changes in shares outstanding. So you have to use CompuStat. But the problem is CompuStat does not keep track of dead tickers or inactive tickers or inactive QSIPs. So we only have so far back that we can go with the CompuStat data. Nevertheless, in my data set, at least 500 securities had periods of time where over 90% had been lent. And I think about of those, about half had periods where over 100% had been lent. And on this list that I put together, it's not just XRT. You have VXX. VXX is the
it's the VIX.
That's
ETF?
the VIX. That's the VIX ETF,
sort of,
has the VIX ETF has its own pathologies because
that's what I mean.
There's a mean reversion with volatility, and the VIX, the VXX, I recall it blew up at some point because they has to keep going down, but it can't keep going down further. So they have to swap out and reissue shares. So the VXX all these strange mechanic problems.
Yeah, it's a weird situation in itself. And then there's a stock on here on the sample of securities with more than 90% short interest, Ameriprise Financial, which I assume was during or going into the financial crisis. Yes. And there the max loan was almost 450%.
445%, right? And they're still around today, which is interesting. I'm glad that they recovered. Peloton's on here, prepaid legal services. So it's not like Logitech, who make mice and keyboards and things.
All of these stocks, which at many times had more than 100% of their shares on. I mean, there's some crazy stuff on here. Like here's one that had almost 4,821% of their shares on loan. I mean, all right, so she's 19,000%. I mean, I'm sure these are all small. Some of these, at least, are small micro caps. But I'm actually curious now because we see examples of stocks today that have very low float and end up trading multiples of their float in a day, and yet you don't even see it show up much in the short. You certainly don't see it in the short interest.
Right.
Sometimes you see some of these anomalous like share lending results, not always. Even that seems like, the idea that something can trade 50 times its float in a day or more, that it's just mind-boggling. Again, like how is this even mechanically possible?
And this gets back to that distinction between volume and the stock and the flow, the flow and the stock, the short volume. And you're right, they trade several times their float in a given day. There's no mechanism to prevent that. They just the mechanism that was put in place and agreed on in the 1970s is we'll figure it out. We'll sort it out later. Kill them all and let God sort it out, as Mark Simpson said once. Like, so even though we have T+1 settlement now, T+1 settlement is fantastic. There's really no reason why we can't have, if not instantaneous settlement, say end of day settlement. I mean, like have some intraday settlement regime. We're dealing with technology that and institutions that are flawed by design and almost can't be fixed. The fact that a stock can trade many times its float in a given day with no real record keeping that you and I, that a bank would be happy with is something that's worth pausing. None of this happens elsewhere in the financial system. It only happens in securities markets. And it happens in securities markets for a very Stiglerian view, which is that the regulated firms spend all of their times with regulators. Whether the regulators are captured or not is a deep question, but at the very least, rules were written either by regulated firms and merely approved by regulators, or with close input by regulated firms. And part of the problem is it's like pharmaceuticals. It's such complex stuff. There are too few retail investors to have an impact, and too small of a voice. And they get some things, the SEC is notorious for taking in retail comment letters that have, misspellings or some factual things wrong, and they just laugh at them or they ignore
Yep,
them.
for sure.
And whereas the nice and shiny letter written by the White Shoe Law Firm on behalf of the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, that's the letter that carries the weight, and that's the letter that gets written. And Reg SHO, I think, is unique because it was one of the few rules that had a lot of retail input. But 90% of rules that the SEC passes have virtually no retail input because nobody understands it. So they don't really have the time. This is in economics, we call this dispersed costs and concentrated benefits. No one person is it worthwhile for me to individually advocate on this issue. It's too costly in terms of time and energy. Whereas for the firms that are affected directly by it, it is worth it for them too. But this is why I think Irvin is so great, and what you guys are doing is you are lowering the cost of action for people who want to take, authoritarian regimes and communists hate it when people organize, right? That's how you take down power, is
That's
you
right.
organize.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so the only way to be heard is to organize a coalition and to become a unified voice for reform in these efforts.
Yeah, I mean I agree with you on comment letter quality as well. Like it does make a big difference. I mean that was our for the last couple of years our main focus had been on getting something of quality into the comment files and getting it into the hands of thousands of people to file
Yeah,
those comment letters. And I think unfortunately what we found is the SEC still doesn't really look at that as 1,000 different comment letters, right? They just see it as a tally on one comment letter.
right.
And we had a pretty disappointing term the last 4 years out of the SEC. We've got a new one coming up. So let's hope that as we turn our attention to advocate for the exact things that you are bringing up in this paper, which is why we know we're so aligned on these issues and why we've talked about working on these issues, that there's going to be, do you think is there any reason for some optimism here? I mean, I think in some of our communications, you seem optimistic about the people involved, the change in leadership at the SEC and what it might mean. So why don't we talk about that for a minute?
Sure. First of all, I am optimistic. I just want to say one thing because I don't want to forget about it. One of the things that I learned writing this paper
Hmm.
is, as you say, the value of fails has not gone down. And there are all kinds of funny things that happen, not in penny stocks or thinly traded securities or even ETFs. There are weird things that happen in huge stocks that everybody trades. One of the strangest things I found was that on the 23rd of September last year, we had two of our highest fail days
Yeah, I saw those jumps in the
in
chart.
Microsoft and NVIDIA, both on the
Really?
23rd of September, and both the NVIDIA fails were 3.8 billion and the Microsoft fails were 4.5 billion, both on the same day. Now, my theory is that this is my theory about a lot of the fails is it's driven by options trading. That's another paper to get into. But a lot of these seem to be
Hmm.
quarterly options expiration. So when you see the fails
Hmm.
show up
Hmm.
the Monday or Tuesday after the Friday of the quarterly OPEX. I think that's what's going on here. So there's some options related issue here, but I just want to point
Yeah.
that out that this isn't all tiny securities. Some of the biggest fail days are in some of the biggest companies.
Hmm.
Anyway, to the current administration, I'm very excited. I think Paul Atkins is a really inspired choice to head the SEC, and I say that because he wrote what I would argue is one of the most elegant dissents of Reg NMS. Now, Reg
It does
NMS,
read very presciently. I'll give him
it
that.
certainly does. Um, like it's as if he had a crystal. Jim Gaffigan jokes about being a parent, and being a parent is like having a crystal ball where you can tell the future, but nobody listens to you.
Yeah,
And that's this Paul
that's a good
Atkins
one.
letter is like he had a crystal ball, but nobody was listening to him. I think it's important to say that it's easier for you and me to get into the weeds on short selling, but let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Our markets are constructs of rules and regulations. There's no free market in securities here. It is the antithesis of the libertarian classical liberal ideal. These markets that we have in the United States
Hmm.
are 100% a construct of committees who got together and decided these are the rules.
Right.
The word regulation, to make regular, means that you make things consistent. And so as a result of whatever happened in the 1920s, the result is that people on committees appointed by the executive branch and working for the executive branch make rules, and they make lots and lots and lots of rules. And those rules are designed in theory to protect retail investors and keep things consistent and regular. The problem is they love rulemaking so much that they forget that there are all kinds of lovely market forces that will do the work of rules for them. Reg National Market System was the system that it used to be that you had stock exchanges throughout the country. There were SEC offices around the country. You had a Denver Stock Exchange. You had a Kansas
Right.
Stock Exchange. You had a San Francisco, Philadelphia. They're all over the country. And Reg National Market System said, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to be one national market system. And not only that, every trade that happens has to happen at the best available price.
Right.
And if it doesn't, then it's not a lawful trade. Well, okay, that's true, but economists know that there's another mechanism that would ensure that happens anyway. It's called arbitrage, right?
Sure. Yeah. Right.
And arbitrage is a beautiful thing. You know, you love sports. Sports betting is fascinating because in sports betting, the reason why sports betting is so lucrative is you have a huge difference between the scientific odds and the order flow odds, because people tend to bet their home team, they bet what they like. So if you know what you're doing, you can do pretty well in sports betting. You can also have huge differences between different books depending upon where you are in the country. And really good sports bettors know how to arbitrage different books. Not advice. I'm simply saying that's how I teach.
I've read a bit
theory.
about positive EV betting, so I know what you're talking about. I would like to mention that I heard that the city of Philadelphia collectively won well over $100 million a week ago, and I think that was just a great wealth transfer. But sure, that aside, yeah.
Anyway, so but what Reg NMS does is it effectively outlaws the arbitrage of the market and enforces arbitrage as a rule. Now that sounds great. It sounds
look,
good.
Let's also, I do think sometimes it's easy to lose a little bit of historical context here. At the time that Reg NMS was being debated, the hold that the NYSE floor brokers had on the market as monopolists and as controllers of order flow was very problematic, and their resistance to electronic trading was very problematic. So there was a goal of Reg NMS, which was to end that.
Yeah.
And then there was the implementation of Reg NMS, which successfully ended that, and then unfortunately brought in a ton of other problems.
Nothing illustrates better the sort of the endemic corruption of the old boys club than my favorite movie, Trading Places, which I watch every year, a couple times a year. And
if
the Duke brothers.
Markets and you're not watching that movie
I show it in every class
basis,
I teach.
I don't know what to tell you. Yeah,
it's the best. I just love that movie so much. And the Duke brothers are the regime that NMS was designed to disintermediate, right?
Yeah. So Eddie Murphy, is he like the electronic market maker coming?
There you go. Right. And so you're absolutely right. It was designed. The intentions were good. What it did is, first of all, it made a bunch of people who had order routing technology rich. I happen to know a few of these guys who were involved in that industry, who built the pipes that run between the exchanges, and they all got filthy rich, and they all have homes in Switzerland and other places. But the thing that it did is it essentially froze. I actually think it had the unintended consequence of making the major market centers more powerful. I actually think that it had the opposite effect. Yes, it killed the agency business, the commission, so that we're not charging fees anymore. But there's very little innovation in the exchange space. We still, markets open at 9:30 and they close at 4 p.m. That's probably pretty silly. I mean, Robinhood has seen how silly that is. There's also all kinds of weird anomalies that happen that finance people document. They call it the close to open anomaly. That on average, if you buy the close and sell the open, you earn abnormal positive returns versus buying the open, selling the close. So the Reg NMS has had this artificial it had the effect of freezing practices and technologies in place for 20 years. And I think that Atkins coming in, and Atkins' letter predicted this lack of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, I think, had the effect of driving a lot of trading off exchange. People get upset about dark pools. Well, dark pools are a reaction to the trade through rule in Reg NMS. You wouldn't have, you'd simply have, imagine
and to the access fee cap, to the government price control, which is the access fee cap.
Price isn't everything in markets. If people who are in markets know this. So if you mandate that all trades have to happen at the best price, all those people who look for different things, different types of services associated with trading, different execution, timing, size, whatever you want, are going to go somewhere else. So people that get upset about dark pools should look to Reg NMS as the reason by forcing everything to be lit and identical and the same. You're going to drive a lot of things into black markets, which is what dark pool trading is. So I think I don't know how easy it would be to roll back NMS, but I do think like I said, come on, we live in a world of distributed ledgers, blockchain technology, instantaneous delivery versus payment settlement is easy to design. You could do it in a weekend of coding. We live in a world where it's time to have a revolution in securities, technologies, and securities markets. I think crypto has tried to do that. And obviously there's all kinds of crazy things happening in crypto, and it's full of fraud, and it's nevertheless, I will tell you from my own experience as an advisor to the Dartmouth Blockchain Club, every week these guys that I work with have a meeting on campus, and they are geniuses. They're mathematicians, they're computer scientists, they're economists, they're all working on projects, they're all doing various versions of rethinking payment systems, rethinking, just basically rebuilding the financial system.
How do you make it decentralized and trustless? I agree. These are fascinating exercises. There's amazing technology coming out of it. They're also rediscovering why you need securities laws, right?
Absolutely.
And so there is, I feel like, some happy medium, and maybe this will be the SEC that figures that out, because they seem very focused on that. But let's, so getting into that just a bit more, the DTCC has cemented itself as sort of, the central obviously the central counterparty for everything in markets. And so before we finish up, I'm glad to hear your optimism on NMS and Atkins. I do think it's something that can be done. I think you could roll back order protection in the access fee rule, for example, reform tick sizes, and strengthen best execution, and markets will work. That's what they did in Europe, and markets are working. They have other issues. They're a smaller market than the U.S., so it doesn't look as good. But when you control for the size of the market quality in other markets is actually better than the U.S. We're just the biggest, and so that can often help to cover up really fundamental problems. But I think it would take a lot of political will to go at Reg NMS by the SEC. I don't know that they're interested, but maybe they are, because maybe they will see it as an opportunity to reduce regulation by making it more intelligent, which would be, I think that would be the approach, and something that a lot of us have pushed for a long time. Anyway, so NMS aside, let's talk. You inserted this as we were talking about. So what should we talk about? So what would Doge, and I'm a Doge skeptic. I'm someone who doesn't believe they've found anything new yet. That everything they're doing is it was all publicly available already, and that they're using tricks to make it look like they're saving money. So color me skeptical on Doge, but let's for the elimination of argument, let's take it that Doge is truly interested in improving government targeting with surgical precision waste, fraud, and abuse while ensuring the good functions of government continue. I don't think that's true, but let's say they are. What would they find if they went into the DTCC?
So, first of all, I just on Doge. I'm old enough to remember when Bill Clinton and Al Gore were proud of balancing the budget, laying off hundreds of thousands of federal employees, and eliminating waste.
Sure.
So,
Right.
it used to be kind of a, then it was the Republicans who started the war machine and spent the trillions on war. So I'm old enough to remember when the limited government talking points were reversed. The DTCC, which we've talked about before, Depository Trust Clearing Corporation,
I'm sorry,
is.
I have computer issues sometimes when
Okay.
streaming for.
I'm going to keep talking, David.
Go ahead. I'm still here. Yeah.
It's weird that I mentioned the DTCC and your camera went down.
Just turned off.
Like if there's one organization I'm nervous about mentioning and winding and ending up in a landfill somewhere, it's the DTCC. And I'll tell a story about that in a moment.
Oh, good. Yeah.
First of all, the DTCC is not officially a government agency. They are owned by the banks and the broker dealers. Now, they're a member of the Federal Reserve System, so they have a special designation as a special clearing firm that has special rights and privileges and protections. When the DTC used to be downtown in Manhattan, I remember going there one day, and it was far more heavily guarded than the stock exchange itself. I mean, the stock exchange had big guys with guns. The DTCC had bigger guys with guns. They clear 2.5 quadrillion worth of trades every year. That's a lot. That's a lot of sausage.
That's a big number. That's a
big number.
My kid tries to think of a big number. That's a good one for them to come.
Rarely do you hear quadrillion used.
Yeah.
We're still thinking in trillions here. But 2.5 quadrillion is a big number. And I recall from the litigation I was involved in, which I mentioned in the beginning, how hard we had to work to get access to the fails data. It was a very big deal. I mean, to get access to those data as part of a discovery process, to convince the court that you could look at these data, that they wouldn't be published, you're essentially, signing away your firstborn. It was a very intense, onerous process, even for litigation, to get access to these data. The protective order was one of the strictest protective orders I've ever seen on these data.
That's crazy.
What's also funny to note, many of your viewers and listeners take it for granted that you can go download the fails data anytime you want. Well, that wasn't always the case. Those data are the result, I'm going to toot my own horn, of FOIA requests that people like me and a guy named Dave Patch and others were continuously submitting to the SEC, asking for fails data. And in those days, you had to ask for the fails data of individual companies, and they would give it to you with limitations because they don't own it. The SEC doesn't own the data. The exchanges own the threshold data, and the DTCC owns the fails data. It's not the SEC's data. And you'd think that wouldn't matter, that would sort of like, who cares?
The DTCC is a self-regulatory organization, which is overseen by the SEC.
Right. And as Suzanne Trimbath used to say, nobody at the SEC really understands how DTCC works. And once a year, they send an intern over to DTCC, which is now in New Jersey, and they say, hey, what do you guys do here? And the DTCC says, well, we spend it, this is what we do. And then the next day, the SEC intern says, is this actually what you're doing? The DTCC says, yes. And they say, great, and they go home. So nobody really understands how the sausage is made over there. And the FTD data is an example. The DTCC was very stingy with allowing access. It wasn't until 2007. That's why, even though you have fails data going back to 2004, you don't see in the fails data, they don't publish a price along with the securities until April of 2007. That's the true start of that time series. That's when the DTCC said, okay, we'll let you have it, and we're going to give you a price, whatever the closing price was on that day with the security, so that the history is complete. It's actually one of the best sources of data that we have on history, because the text files are all there. Sometimes the SEC forgets to upload the text file every 2 weeks. You have to write the intern who does it, but it is done. So
yeah, people tend to get very upset when that happens. Right. Now there's a lot of eyes on this data.
Right. Well, there's a lot of eyes on this data, yeah. So they can't do that anymore. But 15 years ago, nobody looked at it but me and a handful of people in their pajamas. Yeah. And when they forget to upload the text file, we'd get mad about it and write them and say, "Oh yeah, we'll do that tomorrow." Right. What is So now get into I'll put my teacher hat on. What's interesting about Doge is a repurposed agency created by Obama. And I forget what it was called, but that's why Doge has been so, they've been unable to stop it, is because they simply took an existing entity that had a budget and a staff and it was already in place, and they simply rebranded it. So it's not a new thing. It's a reworking of this Obama created agency. I don't know if their mandate, this is where things get tricky, is are they allowed, people want them to audit the Fed. Can they audit the Federal Reserve? That's an interesting legal question. I don't know the answer to that. We're going to find out. If they get Ron Paul and audit the Fed, that will be an interesting thing to do. My guess is that if they can audit the Fed, then that would probably mean that they can audit members of the Federal Reserve System like DTCC. I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to upset DTCC, but it seems to me that if you were looking for not just fraud and waste, but perhaps, I'll tell a story. I once knew, you meet people in this business because you have very difficulty getting information. So sometimes you hire investigators. Investigators' jobs are to ask questions that you can't ask and open doors that you can't open. Mm-hmm. And I once met a guy whom I won't name, who was a career intelligence community person. He'd written several books. He actually a few movies made based upon his books. And a lot of people would know him if I mentioned his name, but I won't mention his name. We asked him to help because we weren't getting any. We couldn't figure out. There's an old joke in like gangster movies. He's like, who do I talk to? Who's the guy that I talk to? Am I talking to you or talking to him? Who am I talking to here? And we were having so little success that we hired somebody to help us through who to talk to. And this guy, I'll just call him Brian. We hired Brian, not his real name. We'll call him Brian. And Brian started looking into various agencies and including the DTCC. And what he came back to me and said was very interesting. His two things. First, he said, this is much bigger than you think it is. He says the fact that you haven't been successful isn't because you're not right. It's because the system exists for the benefit of certain groups that I can't talk about. The second thing he said is this organization you call DTCC, yes, one of its functions is to clear trades, but it may also be the case that its function is to move money from one place to another in such a way that it isn't traceable to government auditors. I don't know if that's true. That's that's what this fellow said to me. And the third thing he said to me is, dude, this is too hot. I can't work on this anymore. So we're going to have to end our relationship professionally. And this is a guy who wasn't afraid to do crazy things or take heat. But he said to me, what you're looking at here is just too heavy. It was like the end of Miami Vice. If you ever watched the show Miami Vice, at the end of Miami Vice, they figure out that all the drugs they're dealing with in Miami are being run by the American government. Right. And that's how the show ends. Like that, they just figure out it's turtles all the way down at the end. All the stuff they've been fighting for years is because it's for the benefit of these black budget ops. And essentially, I don't know if this is true. This is the allegation that was made. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think it would be very healthy for markets and for retail investors to have more sunlight on trade settlement, more sunlight on all of these issues we've talked about today. And I think it would start with I think DTCC should lead the effort to clean things up. It would be on their own.
It would really surprise me if it wasn't, like if that wasn't one of the things that Doge or another governmental agency would have purview over. I mean, again, like it's an SRO. It's quasi-governmental. The government has to, they have oversight. They have, the ability to go into any SRO and examine them. They have examination authority. They have enforcement authority over them. So, I get it that, and that's super. I mean, that's kind of like, that's a crazy story, first of all. So thanks for sharing it. And if it's a way for money to move,
I love my life. I'm very happy. I'm not suicidal. Everything's great.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I got a great life. No, but if if it's a way to fund covert operations, which is sort of like maybe what he was intimating, and that like you need way. Oh boy, there we go. Now we just lost John right as we're starting to talk about funding covert operations through the DTCs. Okay,
I'm
good. There
back.
you
I'm back.
and look, like governments have to do that from time to time, and the again the focus on U.S. aid, for example, like there are certainly vehicles in the U.S. that are mechanisms to move money into covert operations. I've actually got
Right.
several CIA history books back on my shelf over there that are fascinating reads, and I encourage people if you're interested in that. And they talk about this in those books because a lot of the stuff's become declassified. I Part of the problem though is that markets are being used. If that's the case, then there are people out there, I believe, who have figured that out long before anyone was talking about it like we are, and they have figured out ways to use markets in there's that saying, if you have a back door,
Yeah.
then and like a cryptographic backdoor, for example, like if a U.S. government agency is able to unlock your phone or decrypt your messages because there's a backdoor in the cryptographic protocol, that means someone else will be able to figure that out. And it's possible that we've seen in markets that other people have figured that out, have figured
Yeah.
out these loopholes, and are using markets for nefarious purposes to move money from one place to another, where they shouldn't be able to under normal traditional money laundering or organized crime statutes, and that they do that through these mechanisms, through market manipulation, and all of this is just like sort of layer upon layer of problems in our markets. And I think one of the issues, John, is all too often we get fixated on these sort of highly technical issues.
Yeah.
And that's natural for people like us because that's what we do. We study markets. We get deep into the weeds and into the technicalities, whereas not everyone understands how that sort of bubbles up to the surface and why this stuff is important. And it's not just for these issues like what we're talking about, which are, to be fair, would be enough in and of themselves to want to fix markets to address issues like this. But it's also because markets are the backbone of a capitalist system. And if markets aren't
Yes.
functioning and operating properly, then capitalism cannot function. And resources get misallocated, and companies can't raise money. And a lot of the time, the companies that are targeted from these loopholes or these flaws in market mechanics and structure are the ones that you want to be able to regularly access capital markets. They're the innovators, the technology companies, the biotech companies, even the energy companies, right? These are companies that need to access capital markets regularly,
Right.
and it's a serious problem for them. So I don't know. I don't really have an end point for this screed, but it like what you're talking about. It's something, that story just really resonated with me because it's an issue that I think is sort of fundamental to markets right now, and we want markets to function. And when they're not functioning, a lot of people are suffering. It's retail investors who are defrauded. It's companies that can't access capital markets. And if these are proceeds of crime or covert government operations that people don't want to be happening, this is all facilitating that. It's like a negative on top of a negative, right?
Right. Uh, Dave, and just to add to that, I think first of all, one of the problems with economists talk about something called selection bias. We don't know because there were so many companies that were sipping at the capital markets that may have been destroyed by naked. We just don't know. They're gone now.
Right.
They're simply data points that we have in a database somewhere. But it is a lie. It is a cruel lie that naked short selling only affects crappy companies or companies that don't deserve to live. And I, to point you in my paper, table 4 lists the longest companies on the list. At the top are 3 companies everybody knows: Netflix, Krispy Kreme, and Chipotle. And they were on the list for each of them on the list for over 500 days. These were, at the time, they were young companies, they were growth companies sipping at the capital markets, and nobody thought they would make it. and they were
Yep.
ruthlessly. There's nothing wrong with short selling, but naked short selling is a tax. Naked short selling is an institutional tax upon um, young companies and the retail investors that invest in those companies, because it basically means that over the capital they're raising at a depressed rate. These are not, firms that, this isn't Waste Management, whose business model is, we know exactly what Waste Management business is going to be for the next 20 years. These are
Right.
firms that are doing new things. They're hard to value. They're sipping at the capital markets. They have passionate investors. Same thing with Tesla. Tesla had its own battle with short sellers for years, but I always point that out to Krispy Kreme, Chipotle, and Netflix. These are for companies that all of us, like others, Lazy Boy. These are firms
I really wanted you to mention Lazy Boy because I love
that
recliners.
all
I don't
of
know
us
about
know. And yeah, the Canadians love to recline.
we we do.
We
We
do.
often relax. We frankly live life a bit better than I think, our southern neighbors.
Right. Amen.
Y'all work too hard.
Yeah, I'll work too hard. I know. I think I had more hair the last time we met, Dave. But
Me too,
anyway,
unfortunately.
my point with this is that this is I also think it does a disservice to investors who are confused. The SEC has a page of at Reg SHO FAQs, like, oh, don't believe the rumors about naked short selling. It's not
Yeah,
happening. Well, you can
right.
go look at the data. It's obviously happening. So it undermines investor confidence in markets and in regulators. And if you really wanted to serve investors, if you really wanted to, you know, I guess, attack disinformation or misinformation, you would fix this problem. You would understand that this is something that can be easily
Right.
fixed. It's not, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Reg NMS is, we're not going to do that in a day, but a pre-borrow we can do in a day. They did it in 2008. They did it in a day. They could do it tomorrow, and no one would care. Markets would
Hmm.
move on. There are oceans, as Robert Shapiro said on your show a few months ago, there are
Hmm.
oceans of liquidity around us. No one's
Right.
hurting for liquidity in these markets, and requiring a pre-borrow would do nothing but be a better accounting standard. This is simply an accounting standard.
Right.
It's not controversial.
Right. Well, I think we're gonna wrap it up there, John. Thanks again for your time. A fascinating conversation. We've got record live viewership right now, which is just fantastic to see. And it's funny that these these are issues that you would never have thought so many people would care about just a few years
Absolutely.
ago. And they were very much sort of under the surface for wonks, and people who were just studying the stuff and trying to make markets better. And now it's really bubbled up. Getting a pre-borrow requirement really seems like the kind of simple idea that is well supported with evidence. And so let's make that one of the things that we are focused on as we go down to DC and spend time and meet with people there and see if we can get some actual change
Absolutely.
out of this new SEC administration. And I look forward to working with you on that as well, and really
Absolutely. I'd love to do that,
appreciate
Dave.
what you've done for us and helping to educate people and this research. So if someone wants to read your paper, where can they find it? Is it
So
is it
it's
up
it's
yet?
currently I've submitted to SSRN, which is sort of an academic online database. They're considering it. It is a working paper, so it's not finished, but hopefully it will be up soon. And when it is, I'll post the link on Twitter. And Dave, I'd love it if you repost it so people can read it.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll
Send
get
me
it out there for
feedback,
you.
comments, things I get wrong. We spent the text is somewhat short. We spend most of our time on the data tables, but we'll be adding a lot more as the research expands the next few months.
Okay, that sounds great. Yep, we will absolutely get the word out as soon as it's up there. And thanks everyone again for joining us. We're going to have another episode of Let's Talk Markets live this week on Wednesday with Jen Borden to talk about escheatment, another way in which property is being taken from people, and a topic that we have spent quite a bit of time on here as well, and that'll be at 1:30 Wednesday the 19th. So join us for that great episode. And this episode, if you're interested, will be on YouTube. If you want to watch a recording, and if you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe and like button as always, and sign up for more updates from us. And I promise you that this year we will continue to be focused on these issues, and we will continue to keep them at the forefront and stay loud because the work is not done, unfortunately. So,
Right.
all right, that's it for us. Thanks again,
Thanks
John.
for having me,
Appreciate it.
Dave. Thanks for all you guys
Yep.
do.
Thank you. All right.